I don't even remember how many courses I ended up taking in Nietzsche altogether between undergraduate and graduate studies. So, for instance, one of the first courses I ever took on Nietzsche was a course on the philosophy of history. And we began by reading, I think it was Nietzsche's second essay in The Untimely Meditations on the use and disadvantage of history for life. Now, of course, there's so many things just about that title itself that are worth belaboring, but I won't. But I'll just simply say that that speaks to the way in which one can enter Nietzsche in any number of ways. Usually, what happens, and this was certainly my experience in academia, is there are two primary ways into Nietzsche. Now, I don't agree with either of these. So let me be perfectly clear. I do not agree with either of these ways that I'm going to say. The first is by reading Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. The second is usually what happens in undergraduate courses on things like so-called existentialism. And what they read is The Genealogy of Morality. It's a rather short book, but those are going to be the two primary things that get read by Nietzsche and that you'll hear the most about. I don't like either of those as ways into the thought of Nietzsche. Nietzsche is explicit that Beyond Good and Evil is after Zarathustra. And in fact, he ends the text of Beyond Good and Evil with a long quote from Zarathustra. So he's pointing back towards Zarathustra. When you read The Genealogy of Morality, he even says that the third section, the most important section, is an example of the first two sections being put to use as a lens through which one would interpret a particular passage. It's really just a verse in Nietzsche's Zarathustra. And that leads me to the first approach that I like to take into Nietzsche. Now, this is going to be the one that's the most rarely taken, and there's good reasons for why it's rarely taken. I tend to be something of a purist. Nietzsche is emphatic throughout all of his publications that Zarathustra is his masterpiece. All of the books prior to Zarathustra are pointing in the direction of Zarathustra. Thematically, they are. All of these things that they're addressing in various ways are pointing towards Zarathustra, and they come to fruition in Zarathustra. All of the books after Zarathustra are pointing back at Thustra. Zarathustra is an extremely difficult text, mainly because it's so heavy on imagery, and it's very, very often difficult to understand what the imagery is pointing towards. What is the imagery supposed to be an image of? And in fact, there's only one historical person named in the entire book, and that's Jesus. Now, what I'm doing, for instance, on my website, Athens Corner, I'm going through an entire reading of the book Zarathustra for introductory level students, providing various addendum discussions so that one can understand what's being done in the text of Zarathustra. You can only do that, of course, if you have some kind of instructor who's really knowledgeable of Nietzsche. Now, in my case, I feel like I'm more than competent to do that, but it's rare that you come across people that can do that because they have to have a kind of mastery of all of Nietzsche's writings. Now, that's going to be the way that I like to do it. And so the way I phrase it is that whenever things come up about the thought of Nietzsche, the first thing I always say, as something of a Zarathustra purist, is I say, okay, well, hold on a second. Where can we find this topic or this theme in the text of Zarathustra? Because that's going to be, at least for Nietzsche, definitive. And the other approach that's very common in academia that I do not like is when people just begin with something like Beyond Good and Evil or Genealogy of Morality, because you get a very truncated view of what Nietzsche is getting at. Another way that I like to enter into Zarathustra is because I took a course in it, and so I know how it actually works. You begin with Ecce Homo, which is Nietzsche's book about Nietzsche. We have in the West one of the greatest philosophers ever who writes a book about himself. So it's Nietzsche on Nietzsche. How amazing would it be if we had a book like Shakespeare on Shakespeare? What happens in Ecce Homo is that Nietzsche goes through and he has these hilariously provocative titles, one of which is Why I Write Such Great Books. He has an entire section on all of his publications, and he's looking back over all of them towards the end of his life. He's given you these brief little introductions to them. You could start by reading that book, Ecce Homo, and then go back and start from the very beginning to read all of Nietzsche chronologically. Start with, for instance, The Birth of Tragedy, move on to The Untimely Meditations, then you enter into Human All Too Human, then you enter into Dawn, then you enter into Joyous Science, then you get to Zarathustra. That's a wonderful way because you get to see it's one could say it's a kind of genealogical approach following the spirit of Nietzsche. So so that's one way of doing it. Now, I included up there in that picture the book Will to Power. That's Kaufman's, I think that's the only translation of Will to Power in English. I need to say a few things about this. I absolutely do not recommend studying Nietzsche through Will to Power, and I'll explain why. Well, there's a number of reasons why. The reason that you see so many people doing this is because this is what Heidegger does. Heidegger takes one of the lines that Nietzsche has in the Nachlass. Now, the Nachlass, that's just it's a German word that simply means notebooks. For Nietzsche, the Nachlass is the scraps, the leftovers, the remainders, because Nietzsche does in fact publish everything in his life that he wants to. We get the misleading interpretation that he does not from Heidegger. What Heidegger does is there's a whole section in his notebooks where what Nietzsche says is that he's come upon a new idea that's going to be it's going to make Zarathustra look like nothing more than a vestibule to the depth of his real thought. So there's the claim from Nietzsche himself in his notebooks where he says, I've had this amazing insight, and everything I've done, including Zarathustra, is nothing more than an introduction into it. What Heidegger does is he says that this collection of the notebooks, which is what Will to Power is, Will to Power is not a book. It was never published as a book, was never thought of as a book. It was thought of as a title to what Nietzsche was considering to be his masterpiece. But you see from what even the notes itself, and also from a number of letters that he wrote, what you have is a plan for a book that he originally is going to call Will to Power, but he has a number of the chapters that listed of what he wants to cover in the book. And it turns out that none other than Antichrist is one of the chapters. And then as you continue to read through his notes in the Nachlass, you find out that in fact he's trimming down the idea of what that masterpiece is going to be until finally he comes to none other than the Antichrist. So one could say, I think one is far more correct in saying that this book that Nietzsche envisions, which is going to be the culmination of all of his thought and even far deeper than Zarathustra, is I'm sorry, not Will to Power, is the Antichrist. Now, even that requires quite a bit of qualification, though, because you have to, when you read Antichrist, you see that he still has reference back to Zarathustra. So he is not, at the very end of the day, decided that Antichrist is going to replace Zarathustra. Now, this whole topic of the Antichrist being the height of Nietzsche's deepest thoughts, that's what's about to get published in English. It's been translated. Well, let me rephrase this. Heinrich Meyer, who I should also add is he does a lot of work on Leo Strauss, but is not himself a Straussian. I need to emphasize that. He's published a book on Zarathustra, which is quite amazing. It just got translated and published a few years ago. Justin is the one who did that. The only reason he even did the book on Zarathustra was because he wanted to publish on the Antichrist. And that's what Meyer wanted to get to. And he did publish that. It's in German. Justin has translated it, and it will be getting published here within this coming year or two. This is getting very far into the weeds, though, because this is at the forefront of professional research into Nietzsche. So we don't really have to concern ourselves with that, but it's worth mentioning because you get people, when it comes to Nietzsche, who are absolutely adamant that will to power is where you find the depths. And they'll quote passages from Will to Power constantly. I think the best way to interpret the Nachlass itself is the leftovers, the scraps. While it's true that there's very much that you find that's helpful in the so-called Will to Power, you're not going to find what Nietzsche thought was most worthy of being published in his own lifetime in it. In fact, what you'll find that's most published worthy from Nietzsche got published. That's one thing I should emphasize. And also, let me say one last thing here too, because associated with this book, Will to Power, and what is the depths of Nietzsche, is always going to be the topic of Nietzsche going insane. Roughly around 1888, 1889 is when things are going downhill. Nietzsche is losing his mind. Now, that's the lazy man's approach. Anytime you hear someone talking about Nietzsche's life prior to them talking about Nietzsche's thought, then you are in the realm of someone who's at best questionable, because biography is not always philosophy. It's not to say that you shouldn't take into consideration elements of their life, etc. But what it is to say is that you have to take into consideration their thought first and foremost, because very often you'll have people think that they know Nietzsche inside and out because they've read all about his life. They can tell you all about his life, but you ask them, for instance, about Zarathustra, and they haven't even read the damn book. This is the worst possible way to study Nietzsche. You're not even studying Nietzsche. You're studying what gets said of Nietzsche from historians, etc. So let's be perfectly clear about that. The way to understand Nietzsche is not through his life. Now, it is true in Ecce Homo that he says you have to look at a philosopher in relationship to his life. That's not necessarily intended to be reflexive on Nietzsche's own life. What Nietzsche has to say there, I think, applies far more to his Zarathustra. He's indicating that he wants people to look at the life of Zarathustra. And always remember, Nietzsche's larger project involves the critique of Western philosophy up to himself. What he's saying about looking at the lives of philosophers is that up until him, most philosophers are just what we would call theoricels. They're these incel theoricels or something who they speculate about all of these things that are fundamental to life while they themselves don't even live life. So be very, very wary of people who are going to treat the thought of Nietzsche by way of anecdotal references to his own life. Because again, this is simply not how you do philosophy. Now, if you're talking about a second-rate thinker, then sure, maybe you could do something like that. But Nietzsche is not a second-rate thinker. In fact, he's more than worthy of our very, very focused attention to all of his writings. So, okay, two ways so far that I've suggested that are really good to getting into Nietzsche. Number one, jump into Zarathustra. That's going to be a very hard way. Number two, jump into Ecce Homo. Read Ecce Homo. Read what he has to say about all of his various publications, and then go back and start from the beginning by reading his publications. Now, he starts with, I should add, The Birth of Tragedy. Now, there are a number of early works that Nietzsche himself, some of them did not get published, some of them were published later. They're worth reading, and they do constitute great introductions to his thought. So, for instance, Birth of Tragedy comes out in 1872. What you have roughly around 1871 and 1872, well, let me just add another one too, because there's three of them really. So there's going to be the short writings. One's called The Greek State, the other is called Homer's Contest, and the last is called Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks. Those three short little writings really come together in that first publication of The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. So that's something to keep in mind, because a lot of people, I know people who have some of the best opinions and the best thought of Nietzsche. They often say that the best place to start in Nietzsche would be with, for instance, those three little books, right? The Greek State, Homer's Contest, and Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks. I do not disagree with that. I think that's a wonderful place to start. It's going to be right there in the same time period that he's wrestling with the ideas that are going to go into The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. So there's that approach. Now, the last approach. Another approach, this one is common among, I have a group chat where I talk with a number of truly amazing people who are still in academia. The question was, what's the best way to start reading Nietzsche? This is a few. And almost all of the professors agreed that the best way to start with Nietzsche is Twilight of the Idols. The reason they say this is because Twilight of the Idols, it's just about his latest book. It's right there with Antichrist. The reason they say that it's such a good place to start is because it's a very short book, and it encompasses really all of Nietzsche's thought. What Nietzsche himself says of Twilight of the Idols is, he says, let me see, I want to make sure I don't butcher it. He says, that's all of my philosophy in a nutshell. Now, of course, the imagery there is hilarious, because when you read Zarathustra, Zarathustra constantly says that he wants of his disciples that they be nutcrackers. In other words, that they know how to crack to the inside of a nut to get the core of the nut out. Because as it turns out, it's not necessarily the case that there's ever a articulate way into something. What he has here in mind in particular is the so-called, what we would think of as logos. You can't necessarily provide a logos into thought that fundamentally is taking issue with logos. And that's what's going on with that imagery there. That's why he says that's me in a nutshell. So Twilight of the Idols is something of a litmus test, a quick litmus test for people that are either going to get Nietzsche or not get him. This is why Nietzsche has so much regard, for instance, to Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher. Empedocles is going to be the first one to say like attracts like. People either get it or they don't. To try to provide an explanation, a reason, an argument, a logos is simply not going to work. And we see this every day in our lives. You see this on the timeline. Simply scroll down the timeline and you realize some people are just never going to understand each other. It's just not going to happen. And Nietzsche understood that. And that has a lot to do with understanding the very core of his philosophy. So, what I would say is the third way into Nietzsche that's a good way would be simply read Twilight of the Idols. Now, I happen to know that there's only one good English translation of Twilight of the Idols, and I don't think it's been published yet. It's coming out. I have a copy of it. Unfortunately, I can't share it. But Alex Priot has translated it, and it's going to be published pretty soon. He's got an amazing commentary to go along with it as well. But I'll just leave that as it is. Again, you can work from the Cambridge editions of these things, or you can work from the Kaufman editions. Just keep in mind that website. Like I said, I forget if it's Nietzsche Source or Nietzsche Resource. It has all of his publications. The Nietzsche Source has that and more, because there are different versions of the collections of the entirety of Nietzsche's thought that gets into the, I don't want to get into the weeds, but there are editorial decisions that get made and whatnot as to which one is most authoritative, et cetera. But that's not something that beginners need to worry about. Another way that I would add to, now this can't be done because an English translation doesn't exist. Well, it does, but I can't share it because the friend of mine who translated it is trying to get it published. If you can believe it, and this is what's so absolutely amazing, towards the end of his teaching career, which is rather early in his life because he became disenchanted with academia very quickly. He was the youngest professor ever in Germany to be granted tenure. That's how talented he was. But he taught a course on Plato's dialogues. I think he taught it in a total of either 2, possibly 3 times. But that's never been translated into English. Nietzsche's seminar on Plato has never been translated into English, which is just amazing. But that would be a good place to, if one knows German, that would be a good place to start with regard to jumping into Nietzsche. But unfortunately, most this whole discussion in this space is geared towards, like I said, for the most part, autodidacts, people who either didn't go to college at all, or people who went to college, didn't study philosophy, or people who went to college, studied philosophy, but got the academic version, which is usually worthless, and they just want to know how to start reading Nietzsche because it's not at all clear. You go into the bookstores and it seems like he's got all these publications. Where do I begin? Where do I begin? And so what I've suggested is those 3 routes. On the one hand, just pick up Zarathustra and just see what you can do with it. On the other hand, start with Ecce Homo and then go through all of his works chronologically. And then third is start with Twilight of the Idols because you get a very quick summary of the deepest themes of him. Now, this third way is very problematic as well, though, because this gets to the aphoristic style that Nietzsche uses when he writes. Just because you'll find all the heights of Nietzsche's thought in Twilight of the Idols doesn't mean you're going to get the mountains that are going to get you there. So you're given, in a sense, these aphorisms, but you don't know how to connect them. In other words, they fill in the details that he's not going to provide you with. Nietzsche, so the aphorisms really strike them and they say, wow, holy shit, there's something there. In other words, he's trafficking in the art of cultivating wonder. That's what aphorisms do. They seem to strike at something absolutely fundamental about human life, but not in an exhaustive way, but in a way that's so powerful that you want to explore it further and really articulate it out. This really is what's going on in the so-called competition between poetry on the one hand and philosophy on the other. The thing about poetry is that we say that it speaks to us in a certain way. It affects us in a way that we have always wanted to articulate, but we just haven't been able to do it in our own words. So in that regard, all poetry points towards philosophy in the sense of providing an account of things. And so that's what is going on with so very much in Nietzsche with the aphoristic style, is that you see what Nietzsche is doing is he's wanting to turn back the hand of time to back when poetry itself was understood as philosophy. That's why he's going back to the pre-Socratics, because even from his very first publication, The Birth of Tragedy, he says that everything went wrong in the West, beginning with Plato's Socrates, because that's when we get this hyper emphasis on logos and so-called reason, rationality, that drowns out the the very powerful element of poetic insight. And so that's why that's why he's on the one hand always engaged in an argument with Plato, but still drawn to Plato in many respects because Plato still does provide on many occasions these mythic elements that combine in the philosophy in a certain way. So that's why he's turning back to the pre-Socratics, because the pre-Socratics write very often in these fragmentary forms deliberately, we presumably, because they're still giving credence to the possibility of poetic insight being that which guides thought itself, which, and when I say thought itself, it can be what we understand as art. It could be what we understand as philosophy. It encompasses all of these things. So that's what's going on there. I guess I would end this discussion with just one last observation that I've found very recently, which I think is my new favorite way into Nietzsche. I have I've long loved the Untimely Meditations, which was his second publication. It's a collection of 4 essays. The first of which is on David Strauss. He was a contemporary of Nietzsche who was celebrated throughout Germany as one of the greatest public intellectuals, but also a professor. The second essay is on the use and disadvantage of history, which is really about science altogether. The third essay is on Schopenhauer. It's titled Schopenhauer as Educator. And the fourth essay is entitled Richard Wagner and Beirut. That collection of essays, and you have to read them in chronological order because the structuring of the text is so absolutely crucial. There's a very powerful argument to be made that reading those essays in chronological order is precisely what reveals the deeper teaching that's going on in that text.